International Media TV, television that listens to you.
Hi, I'm Johnnie Burrell. Welcome to the program.
Mention the names Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, and you are most likely going to get an immediate reaction, a strong reaction, no matter what race you are, no matter what income you have, no matter your station in life. Everyone from the President of the United States on down seems to have a strong opinion about this case. In fact, the Martin-Zimmerman case has become a kind of shorthand for the status of race relations in America. And for many people, it is a graphic example of the inequities in the criminal justice system. Many people were surprised by the verdict that George Zimmerman got, that he was found not guilty after shooting an unarmed black teenager who was doing nothing but going back to his father's house with his iced tea and candy. But one person who was not surprised or shocked is with me right now. He is John Burris, and he is one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country. Thank you, John, for taking time out of your busy schedule and coming by to chat with us.
It's good to be with you.
We're going to talk about this case. We're going to talk about some of the bigger issues in the case, and then we're going to talk about your own career. So let's start out by where were you the day that the verdict came down, and how did you hear about it? I know I was at a party for a labor leader, and it just, when the tweet came into somebody's phone and they told us there was the party atmosphere, the air went out of it.
Well, I had been doing TV monitoring with MSNBC, so I was actually on the set waiting for the verdict to come in. And there was this sense of optimism at some point when the jurors started asking questions about manslaughter. But I didn't think that was really true. I just thought that they were asking questions about it. The judge was unable to give a clarifying point. And to me, the issues of self-defense were the underpinnings of the manslaughter. And because the case had not been argued properly, from my point of view, I didn't really think that the jurors saw the issues of manslaughter. So I was not surprised about the not guilty. Very, very disappointed about it because I understood the ramifications of it. Had been talking about Trayvon Martin now for over a year and a half. And so I was disappointed. I wish the prosecutor had done a better job. I wish that the defense lawyers did not play the race card the way they did. But all of it put the case in a posture where it was more likely than not that a defense verdict was going to come about.
We're going to talk a little bit more in a second about what you think the prosecution could have done differently, but you brought up the race card. Now, the judge said race was not a part of this trial.
Right.
But many people said race became a part of the trial. In fact, Eugene Robinson, one of the Washington Post columnists, said race came into the trial before there even was a trial, from the day that the incident happened in February of 2012, and that it was even more pronounced when they chose 6 white women for the jury.
Absolutely. This case was a classic situation of racial profiling. The optics were, you have an African-American boy, teenage boy, walking, minding his own business, on a cell phone with a hoodie on, and someone says that person is suspicious. That George Zimmerman viewed him as a suspicion. He then characterized him as other people who always get away with it. He had called up the telephone for African-American men for a number of times. So in his own mind, it was a race person. It wasn't just a suspect, it was a black suspect from his point of view. So that's the first component. But Eugene Robinson is totally correct that when they selected an all-white jury, they essentially selected people who had no experience, none, with the issues of racial profiling. They had no one in their lives that could relate to that. So the case was maybe lost then, but it got worse than that because the judge issued an order that says you cannot say racial profiling. And so it was profiling. He was then profiled as a suspect, and all that's true, but it was really because of his race. But the defense is the one that really interjected the issues of race. It was the way they cross-examined Rachel Gentile, trying to suggest that she was an ignorant African-American teenager, and they used that and they played that, and that went for the jury, basically saying this African-American woman is not part of what you are, and if Trayvon was part of her, those are black people. Those are not people you can identify with. But then
I was going to say, in fact, when they interviewed one juror on TV who's anonymous, she basically showed that she couldn't really relate to Rachel at all.
They couldn't relate, and this was the jury selection problem. This is the problem the defense lawyer, the prosecution had, is they did not understand the issues of race themselves. They were not accustomed. This is the real problem with this case. This was, in essence, the trial of a police officer, quasi-police officer. The prosecution of a police officer is totally different than the regular prosecution of cases. And so they didn't quite understand that. We saw that here in California. I'm a plaintiff lawyer. I have sued police all the time. I know the challenge of trying to prosecute against police. They did not. And so they didn't see it. So they were sort of duped into believing that it wasn't about race, when the defense counsel always knew it was about race. And he played race. You know, he pulled out the card with Trayvon, the shirtless thing, and trying to suggest this is a thug kind of person. They talked about him wandering around the neighborhood. They brought in this white woman who basically said, I had been burglarized months before by another African American. Well, why was that allowed? Because that really was to show these jurors, this woman is just like you. And she was robbed by an African American. And we don't really know what Trayvon was going to do. He very well may have been a person who was going to rob you. And that was another race card that they played. And I was just dumbfounded that this kind of thing was allowed. And so even though, and then and the whole argument that Trayvon was responsible for his own murder was unbelievable and beyond the pale.
I was surprised that the judge let that video animation come into the trial, because it set up in people's minds the idea that Trayvon was the aggressor, that he struck the first blow. Why was that legal? I think, don't understand why you could do that.
Well, it wasn't allowed in the case in chief, but we lawyers are allowed to put forth demonstrative evidence. And that is to say, we think this evidence shows this. It clearly was the defense lawyer's interpretation. The problem with it is the prosecution could have done the same thing. They could have had their own theory of how
Why didn't they prosecute it in a different way? In fact, some people have suggested that the state of Florida or the DA really never wanted to prosecute this case, and that they didn't put their whole heart into it.
Well, I certainly, as the case unfolded, I wondered whether the prosecution knew what they were doing. They didn't seem to understand. They were not aggressive lawyers. They didn't object timely. They let the defense lawyer basically ask questions that were clearly not proper, and they never objected. Case in point, the defense lawyer says to the sergeant, do you think he was telling the truth? He says, yes. Objection. Objection, judge. That's an improper question. You don't get to comment upon the testimony of a witness. Now, they do that the next day. Well, that's stupid, because now you are reiterating what has been said. And so it was that kind of thing that happened throughout the trial. Now, from my point of view, I could say they were incompetent. I can also say they didn't understand how to do this case. I can also say, yes, they were thrown into a case that they didn't really think they could win. They may have thought that if we were able to get the audio statement in that Trayvon was the person who was yelling for help, that they could win the case. But they lost that issue. And they lost that issue because they got a quack to come in and say it, and the other side had the FBI guy, you know, who could come in and say, look, according to traditional standards in the profession, you couldn't find out, you couldn't determine whose voice it was. The case was lost, in my view, and I know that people will disagree with this, but I, as a lawyer, know when this case was lost. One, jury selection, clearly lost. But when Jonathan Good testified, and he said that Trayvon was on top of him. And
Jonathan Good was the neighbor who said that he saw them fighting.
He saw them fighting. He looked like MA type style. But in any event, he gave some credibility to George Zimmerman that he was in fact on the bottom. Even though somebody else has said something else, it clearly could have been that they'd been rolling around. But they didn't offer any testimony. And then shortly thereafter, he has the shot, and he does have the injury. So in my view, that was the end of the case. Sure, a lot of it was address work, because from then on, the prosecution should not have been trying to do a case for second-degree murder. Even though the mindset of George Zimmerman was clear, those a-holes, they always get away with it. You know, he's suspicious, he looks like he's on drugs or something, none of which were true. But once you get into the fight, then it's every man for himself. And from there, the question is, did he act unreasonably or not? And so the prosecution should have focused on that, but they didn't. They kept trying to say the first part of the case, they wanted everybody to start from the beginning. I got it. It's racial profile. There's no doubt about it. But now there's a fight. And in that fight, people have a right to use self-defense. But the question is this, which they've never developed. Who was the aggressor? Rachel Gentile says that George Zimmerman was the aggressor. Well, if that's true, then you can't start a fight, start a confrontation, and then kill and shoot your way out of it. You have to withdraw. And if you don't withdraw and you use force, then you can be guilty of manslaughter.
But in a stand your ground state where there's a stand your ground law, does that still apply?
Even in a stand your ground state.
Because some people feel that the outcome of this trial has opened the door for just what you said. Open the door for people to start the fight, then kill the person and say, I was protecting myself.
But the law does not provide that. The law is very clear. If you were the aggressor, you cannot stand your grounds without first retreating or trying to make an effort to retreat. Excuse me. Otherwise, you have manslaughter. And so the prosecution never even suggested that Rachel might have been correct in her assessment.
So in your mind, this really should have been a manslaughter conviction.
Absolutely. I thought this was a manslaughter case from the very first day. When I saw the pictures of George Zimmerman with the injuries to the back of his head and a bloody nose, that's a fight. Okay, that's a fight. And when you have a fight and who's winning, then it's the question of, is this a good faith but unreasonable belief? Did you start this fight and then try to fight and then shot your way out of it? These are issues to me that all went to the question of manslaughter. The prosecution never developed it and never argued it. And so it was very disappointing in seeing that as a lawyer, because the elements were there, but I don't even, and plus they allowed for terrible instructions to go before the jury. So the manslaughter instructions were confusing. I mean, I was on a TV show at the time, and I said, look, the manslaughter instructions are confusing. This jury may not ever be able to figure that out. And so when the jurors came back with a question, and I said, and the judge says, I can't answer that, and I know the judge couldn't, and they said, well, the judge says, come back with another question. I knew they couldn't come back with another question because they couldn't figure out what the kind of question to ask, because they were caught in the mumbo-jumbo of the law. That's the prosecutor's fault for not making sure those instructions were clear. They had a stand your ground instruction. That's okay, but you should have had an instruction that says, if you are the aggressor, you cannot avail yourself of stand your grounds. And it may have been that Trayvon Martin could have availed himself of stand your grounds. And so these matters were not properly focused up where a jury could see them. And that's on top of the fact that you didn't have a jury that was for you, because that jury could not understand, you know, the racial profiling. But you didn't have to do the case on racial profiling. You could have done the case strictly on manslaughter and says it was unreasonable for him to do what he did, particularly if he was the aggressor.
So this leads to why so many people were angry, especially African Americans afterwards, because it plays right into what many of them feel is that, and not just African Americans, there were a lot of people
were upset
who believe this, but African Americans especially just don't get a fair shake in the criminal justice system.
That's fundamental to the process. I've been involved in the criminal justice system for a mighty long time. I'm a former prosecutor in Chicago. I did defense work there. I did prosecution work here in Alameda County. I did criminal defense work here. I do civil rights work. There's one axiom that's fundamentally true. African American men will not get a fair shake in the system. And they don't get a fair shake in the system starting from the day that they're stopped. The moment they're stopped, you got drugs on you. If you're a white kid, you may get to go. If you're a black kid, you are not going. Because And so from the arrest, the detention, the arrest, to bail, to the judging, to sentencing, the whole step along the way, all the way to state prison, blacks get the worst aspect of the whole system. That's just a fact.
With all the work that you've been doing all these years trying to combat that, with the kinds of cases you have taken, with the number of cases we've seen, like Trayvon, as we all know, as you and I especially know, not the first. We had Amadou Diallo, we had Oscar Grant, we had Sean Bell. The list is long. Why are we still having to fight this same
Well, number
battle?
one, because the people in charge, fundamentally making the decisions, are right. And then also, there's a dance that's involved here. It really is. It is fundamentally ingrained in the whole institution from day one. And people see it through the lens of the criminal justice system. But fundamentally, the black aspect of that system is already preordained. And I'll tell you this, I've been saying this since 1988. You know, I was one of the first people to get out there. The war on drugs, which has contributed largely to what we have now,
In terms of the number of
people
incarcerated
in incarceration, but it was before then, before the system took place, was really a war on the black community. And there was an economic aspect to it, because the more arrests you make, the more money the cities get, the more money the federal governments get. And to the extent that arrests can be made, it was easy to arrest the black person on the corner than it was the white person in the hills. And so as a consequence, the black people became the people that had to bear the brunt of the drug war. And as a consequence of that, in my view, it becomes full employment for white boys. Just flat out full employment for white boys. And the reason being that the people who are winding up in jails used to be the people who were the carpenters, you know, who were the welders, who were the blue-collar people for the most part, who took care of their families. They worked on the shipyard. My family is included in all that process. Those people are not there anymore. The people who used to cut the grass and had a little business, a hauling business, those people are not there. And it's because the war on drugs and the impact of the criminal justice had removed them from society. And when they let them out, they have a strike against them. They have a mark. And that mark is a felony conviction.
And that trickles down throughout the entire community in terms of what happens to that person after he's out of prison.
No question about
whether
it.
He becomes employable, whether he becomes marriageable, whether he becomes a good father figure, and all of the kinds of things that we're seeing being played out within the African American community.
I see this every single day. Last night, I'm working on a case up in Vallejo where 3 men were beaten up by the police a number of years ago. Well, all of them have felony convictions. None of them are employed, at least one is employed doing handyman work. The other 2 are not employed, and they haven't been employed for a number of years. And when you have felony convictions, you are at the mercy of whoever employs you. And so if you have any slant of an attitude problem because the working conditions are poor, you get fired. But it's no question, Michelle Alexander, who has documented this whole thing in the new Jim Crow, things that we have been looking at for years, is clear.
A book that people should read.
Everyone should read, and you should read it for purposes of inspiring your kids and your family to do better. I talk often about protecting your record. It is, you know, it reminds me when I used to, first time I traveled to Africa, and you've all been there, and you realize the most precious thing you have is an American passport. Absolutely. Everybody wants one. Well, here in the States, the most important thing a kid has is a clean record. A record that is not one that's filled with criminal justice with felony convictions. And I want to tell you, prosecutors, the police, they're all in the business of giving African American boys and men felony convictions, because that is a detour to life. And young men don't understand that. They don't appreciate that. And I'm going to tell you, it's arbitrary, because you don't have to do it.
Another book that people should read is your own. You've written about some of this in your book, Blue versus Black.
Blue versus Black, let's end the conflict between cops and minorities. And what I try to do, because my practice has moved more into civil rights and police misconduct, is to let you know that there are a number of people, everyday people, who are beaten and mistreated by the police. But also, the police also have sort of a culture. And every department has its own culture. And that culture is really about getting arrested, treating people poorly if that's the culture, and not being held accountable for it. And as I've been involved in the city of Oakland for a number of years, and not only in cases, but also in trying to reform the department. The big issue that we have in there always is one of accountability. How do you hold the officers accountable for what they do? If you just excuse it, boys will be boys, girls will be girls, then you only perpetuate the culture that exists of brutality. And so we've been at the forefront of that, trying to fight that. We've been there
you in your book, you have a 10-point
I had a 10-point plan. And
yeah, can you just talk a little bit about that in terms of
what
you see as some solutions?
What I was talking about at the time was holding officers, having better internal affairs departments, hiring people who have more of a relationship with the African American community, holding people accountable for the conduct they're involved in, and the big issue is having a consistency of discipline, because officers need to know if you engage in certain kind of discipline, you will be held accountable. And on the promotional level, really talking about who gets promoted. That if you have this history of brutality, history of internal affairs complaints, you ought not be promoted. I also talk a lot about community policing. I think that at the time, community policing was, quote, talked about, but very few people engaged in it because the officers themselves thought that it was not a good place to go for promotional opportunity. And so I thought that all officers should be rotated through community policing as well as internal affairs, so they have a better sense about what the community needs. My huge issue that I talked about is officers need to know how to de-escalate. That they don't always, that if you use your words and you talk to people, you can get people to do anything, even the worst criminals. And we see this with women officers. Women officers don't resort to physical brutality that often.
They don't shoot first and ask questions later.
They don't shoot first. You don't have women in many shootings. We have a couple, but not many. And generally, if I have one, there's something there that justifies that. Women talk. And so you have this, and so otherwise you have this male ego kind of thing, white men lording over black men. I just finished this case very recently, a strip search case in the city of Oakland, where officers, white men, were causing black men to pull down their pants, and so they can search them, ostensibly looking for drugs.
In the street, having them pull down their pants.
And I sued the department here, and we got a big verdict on it. But the important part, what I saw was it was about humiliation. It was trying to humiliate these men because they all had a strike against them because they had a felony conviction, they had a crime. So you could do that. You could say you're on felony probation, then that means parole. That means we can search you for no reason. Our view was, no, you can't. You got to have a basis to search it. What did they do? But they certainly don't get to pull their pants down and search their private parts for the fun of it. And so it's a huge, huge issue. So those are the kind of issues I've been involved in, the Ryder's case and others, trying to get the policing in this community to be more constitutional. But I will tell you, it's not just in this city. I am all around
every city.
I'm all around Northern California dealing with cases. I was just finishing a case this week. I was on the phone before I got here on a case down in Greenland. Greenland is on the other side of Monterey, where a young Hispanic boy got killed by police down there. And then we got him out in Fresno, all the way up Northern California. We haven't. So it's not just Oakland.
Are there any points of light, so to speak, any place? I mean, you've been working at this for so many years. You are out there in the trenches all the time. Is there something you can point to that says it's getting better? Or is it just the same as many people say we haven't made much progress?
I will say this. There's a lot more training of police officers than not, way before when I first started out. And even though they would not admit it, that the impact I have on them, and they will admit it some, is that it's caused them to rethink in many ways the department. One thing to take in mind, in the Oscar Grant case, which is a horrible, horrible shooting, that people in the departments believed that it was a mistake on the part of the officer and that he pulled his taser, he pulled his gun instead of his taser. Well, what that meant, but true or not, is that every department went back and gave training to all officers to make sure those officers did not make a similar mistake. That's a positive benefit. I've been involved in cases where shooting policies have been examined, the dog bite policies have been examined, and of course I'm involved in Oakland where the whole department is under supervision that we're working on. So, points of light, Yeah, there are points of light, some of what you don't see. I mean, I've had cases where we've had the community and the police officers talk about things and improve the relationship. But, you know, these are slow gains. It's a lot better, I think. I'll tell you, we don't have the vicious beatings that we had before Rodney King.
And that is really a lot because of the work that you did on the Rodney King case.
When I did the Rodney King case, I mean, it was the vicious beating. I had cases like Rodney King before that were not on cameras. But after Rodney King, you know, you don't see those kinds of beatings anymore. You have beatings, but not this unassailable, just unconscious beating, because, number one, you don't know who's watching. And number two, that discipline is more likely to occur. And you have to justify that kind of level of beating. So we don't have that. We have beatings like I'm doing this case now, but clearly not on the level in which we had with Rodney King, when your face was all smashed in and, you know, you've been beaten with an inch of your life. That's a good thing. So you see these things happen internally. I talked to a lot of police lawyers, and they tell me that, you know, they told me, Burris, you're having more impact than you think you're having. And because people know when I fire a student, then they go back to see what did we do wrong. Now, that's not to say that they're doing everything right, because they're not. I still, my phone rings off the hook every day. But that's the one area that I can have decent impact. The criminal justice system, I've sort of given up on that. I mean, I just think that is fundamentally so
But can you afford to give up on it since we all still have to deal with it?
Well, whether I can do it. I mean, there are new lawyers coming along. I put my time in on it. I put a lot of time in on it, and I was very frustrated. And I would probably say I would not be practicing law if I had not changed, because the criminal justice system will tire you out. Because what you're doing, in the most part, is just, as someone says, there's this child line on the way to state prison. And all you're really doing is putting somebody on that train. It's whatever stage it is that's going to state prison. Well, I refuse to do it. I just refuse to do it. And I fought very hard, aggressively. I didn't take no prisoners when I was in that area, but I realized that, so what? And I deal with prosecutors who are very inhumane people who think that every black person should go to jail for whatever period of time. They have no feelings about families, no consequences that they're having on people. And so I realized that younger lawyers got to deal with that. I found my niche that works perfectly fine for me, and it works in terms of what I'm trying to do, because I really dislike the police beating up and killing people. I really do. I mean, and that's something I don't think they have a right to do, and it's something that I can do something about. That's the big thing. I can do something. I can't do much about the criminal justice system.
Is that what keeps you going? Is that what you're most proud of?
Absolutely. That I'm in a position to make a difference for people and represent them in ways that affects their lives. Now, they may not always appreciate it. I get them money in case, or I can change policy sometimes. But I'm proud of that, but I'm also proud of the fact that I'm training other lawyers. I got young lawyers that I think are going to be real warriors, who have been with me for a while now, who started out as baby lawyers, and I've given them a lot. I've given them what I have. Every day I give them what I have.
Bringing along that next generation.
And it's important to me that there be warriors out here, because I'll tell you this, there's always going to be warriors. There's going to always be. There have always been Jewish lawyers who are warriors. There always haven't been a lot of black lawyers who are warriors in the civil rights area. There's some, of course. Thurgood Marshall was one. There's other people around the country. One of the things, the beauty of what I am, is there are a lot of people like me. There are people like me in every major urban area. There really are, and I've come to meet a lot of them. And so I don't feel like a lone wolf. I feel like in this area, the geographical area, I'm in a position to do what I'm doing. I'm fortunate I get to do it. And that I'm hopeful that the next group of lawyers will also see that what we're talking about is social progress, and that you can't win the entire battle, maybe not in your lifetime, but you can make it possible so somebody else can contribute along the way. And just remember, I wrote this article around Trayvon and the decision, and I made reference to how the black people must have felt after Dred Scott, okay? These people just like us, trying to take care of their families under terrible circumstances. But they survived. And our parents grew up, and certainly mine and probably yours, in the 20s and 30s, and you know, and they were kids, and they got through the 40s when things were what they were.
And I grew up in the South during segregation, so I have a point of reference as well.
And so we know that there's movements forward. And it may not be a post-racial society in our lifetime, and I don't expect it to be. I think what the president had to say.
I was going to ask you about that. Do you think his comments, because he did talk about that African Americans are viewing this through a historical lens, and therefore that anger is justified. Do you think his comments were needed and helpful?
His comments were needed, and they were helpful because the vast majority of white people don't understand this. They don't have this sense of history. You know, remember this, they were not taught black history. So they don't have any reference. They may know the Dred Scott case, they may know about Plessy versus Ferguson, but they don't understand what Reconstruction was all about and what that really meant and how that turned life around when Reconstruction ended and the black codes came into place. And what that meant is that black people were living under these particular rules. Or in our own case, your family's in the South, my family's in the South, and the life they had to live, and their parents had to fight through it. I always say I'm fighting my dad's battle.
Yeah.
And mainly because he worked on the shipyard, and I was upset as I became an adult that he had to take stuff from people who he was a lot smarter than. And
I tell young people that I went to all segregated schools, right, and they're like shocked. They're like, "You're not old enough to have done that." I'm like, "Yeah, it wasn't that long ago, right, that they ended segregation."
I'm reading a book now on Southern Burrell, and I'm reading it because I want to get a sense of the segregation aspect of Birmingham at the time. And this is right after 1963, and how this baseball team was integrating the place, and the players were treated very badly. This is 1964. This is almost 20-something years after Jackie Robinson. It's after Brown versus Board of Education. It's after the bombing, and Birmingham was still segregated.
Yes, and there are still instances today where you can find those kinds of situations. You mentioned families earlier. You yourself are a family man.
Absolutely.
You have sons?
I have 2 sons and 3 kids of my own. My wife and I have a blended family, and she has 4, so we have 9. And we have a brood. And I will say this, most of them, a good hunk of them are lawyers. I mean, of her 4 kids, 2 are lawyers and others in law school. I just have a daughter who just graduated from law school.
And your wife is a lawyer?
And my wife is a lawyer.
You guys are out there fighting the good fight for everybody.
My wife is a law professor, and she teaches at North Carolina Central, and part of our mission is training future lawyers. I speak at the school every year. I do a men's day at the school where I talk to men about what life is going to be like for them.
That is one of the things I wanted to ask you. What do you tell your own children, your own sons, and especially what do you tell young African-American men today?
Well, first off, when the case went down, my nephew called me from New Jersey, and he says to me, what does this decision mean? And he wanted to know, was he going to be safe? And I said to him, I can't assure that you're going to be safe, but let me just tell you. Not only do you have to deal with the George Zimmermans of the world, but you got to deal with the gangsters of the world too, and the police. And you're more likely to be killed by gangsters and the police than you are by George Zimmerman. On the other hand, if you dress in a certain way, and you're handsome, and he's a handsome young guy, he's 20 years old, he's handsome, right? He's a good-looking guy, he's going to college. I said, but if you go into a neighborhood and you got that hoodie on, you got the stuff on your head, you got baggy pants on your waist, and you're strolling along listening to music, I'm going to tell you that the other people may not view you that way. And so you have a responsibility to protect yourself. And part of that is when you see something like that may be confronting you, you need to know how to de-escalate that. It's not just the George Zimmermans of the world you got to worry about. You got to be able to de-escalate the police, and you got to be able to de-escalate the gangsters, because the gangsters are more likely to kill you in your own neighborhood than George Zimmerman is, because he's not coming to your neighborhood. You got to go to his neighborhood to get killed, but you in your own neighborhood, the gangsters can kill you and the police can kill you. So I talk a lot to kids, young men, about de-escalation, that it's on you to protect yourself. That's not necessarily physically. Of course you have to protect yourself physically, but you have words. And it's how do you communicate those words to the opposition or whoever you're dealing with that can save your life. And of course I talk to them about the police, which is my big issue, and you make sure your hands are where they can be seen at all times.
That's a tremendous burden, though. There was one mother I heard in a town hall meeting say that her son, who's a teenager and a big kid, she says when he goes out of the house, sometimes he wants to put on his baseball cap backwards, and she says she thinks he should have the right to do that.
He absolutely
but
does.
she doesn't let him go out of the door with his baseball cap on backwards because of what you're saying, because somebody else may see him and get the wrong idea, and she says she wants him to come back home alive.
Absolutely, you know,
It's a big burden for kids to have
don't
to
come
carry.
back sometime. I have a case that happened recently, young 22-year-old, 23-year-old African-American kid, single man, living with his mom. She raised him, you know, and he works at a job. And he goes out, going out for the night around 9 o'clock. He has contact with the police. That boy is killed. Killed. And the mom is like, he just left here. He wasn't no gangster or anything like that. He worked at a regular job. It happens. You go out and you don't come back. Killed by the police. Okay? So you try to give kids tools. I do try to tell kids, one of our very good friends, a judge here, has a grandson whom I work with and tried to help. I have this men thing that I do with boys annually that's called Boys to Men, the Way Forward. And he was just at my thing last year. He's walking down the street, he's 17 years old, he is killed. Killed. And you know, these things happen in the community. So it's not just George Zimmerman that you got to watch out for. You got to watch out in your own neighborhood and who your friends are and what you're getting into, and learn how to de-escalate and hopefully get out of town as quickly as you can. But but college guys and people in law school, I talk to them about families, making sure you take care of family, that the law is a jealous lover in many ways, but you have to keep perspective. Certainly it's hard for me to say that because I worked very, very hard when I was a young lawyer. Probably wasn't good for my family, and I had kids and all. And so I try to keep that from happening, keep your family intact. And also the big issue around young lawyers is vices. It's very easy to get vices, vices. Drugs, alcohol, women, these all become vices. I mean, the wrong kind of women for you.
And that happens for all lawyers, not just African Americans.
Well, I know, but I'm saying the vices can get you. And, even my daughter who just graduated from law school, I said to her, look, don't let the vices do to you that it destroys the very thing that you've been working for, because it can. There are many lawyers who have lost their careers because of vices. And they may not even know it. It's a pressurized profession, but you do have to work at it, and you have to protect yourself. And so I'm a sage in many ways because I've represented a lot of people. I've seen, I have represented people across the entire spectrum of the African American community, and so I've seen them in bad situations. And I've seen them get hurt, I've seen them cry, I've seen them get beat up, and of course I've seen people get killed who should not be dead. So I have a wide breadth of experience in seeing the African American community.
And a career of which you can be very proud. In fact, you were chosen as one of the top 100 lawyers, correct?
I have been chosen at various stages of my career for top honors. But I don't, it's interesting that happens, because it's not anything that I really care that much about. I'm sort of past.
But it speaks to your effectiveness.
It does.
Yeah.
I mean, it's no question that I have the ability to talk to various communities. People listen to me when I have something to say. They see me on television. They're happy that I got something to say. I got it. I mean, I have an elder statesman kind of perspective on life that has been built up. So I'm probably more interested in the ability to communicate to the everyday people than I am about honors and accolades that you get, because I also know that at the end of the day you're trying to help people understand the complex issues that exist. I do this radio program on this religious station that I do every week, and what I do is take a couple of vignettes of something that's happened, and I like to inform them of what this means. Like I just talked about the president, I talked about the case, I talked about gay rights, I talked about the Supreme Court stuff. So for that particular audience, they get from me every week information about things that affect their lives. And so and people call me up, or they run into me. I was on radio yesterday, and so that's important. Or they see me on television. So I know that what's important, and I learned this early, that mass communication can have much more effect than you can on one situation, and I learned that in school. So I appreciate the ability to communicate more broadly than the four corners of an individual case.
And we appreciate the fact that you took your time to come and talk to us today.
Well, gladly.
It was a wonderful interview. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's always good talking to you.
Yes, and thank you for watching.